on these loans. So this is, these three pilots, DIB is no longer a pilot, just to quickly show that, this is no longer a very esoteric concept. This can be done. It is more complex to structure, but at the same time, the outcomes that can be achieved are higher, not just the same, are higher, and, creates a discipline and creates a scale, which is probably not achievable through direct financing. Maybe I can just quickly flip the next slide through, Aparna, and move to my final slide, which is that, where are we going from there, as Karthik asked. So we are looking upon these as, as instruments through which we can impact not just the education sector, but many other sectors. So the DIB, like I said, is achieving outcomes and is achieving deeper outcomes than what we were getting in a non-DIB structure. So we definitely want to scale instruments like that and hopefully scale them now in partnership with the government and have social impact bonds. Vartana and ISFC, the school financing companies, pilots that we've done, they were much more pilots where we were the only funder. And these now we are looking at putting through larger fund-like structures. Kaizen is one of the partners, and they're speaking tomorrow through the conference, who is looking at extending similar pilots and similar instruments to a much larger set of financial intermediaries. And we are also looking at exploring such pay-for-performance models for other sectors like skilling and jobs. And as we talk, there is an advanced conversation which is going on with the National Skill Development Corporation to put together such an instrument. So there is a lot of scope in where we can take it from here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Prachi. It's just fantastic to see the range of what you guys have worked on. And, the classic DIB, obviously, is something that is very interesting, but equally interesting is the impact linked debt. And the fact that, this can be applied, as your examples show, either to the intermediary, which is what Vartana is. Vartana is an NBFC that lends to the schools so they can build infrastructure, or it can be lent to the individual end user, as you guys are doing to EduHands, which is a student or the family that needs to pay for the education.
Yes.
And look, and we see education and skilling as sort of part of a curriculum. So it makes a lot of sense that as part of the spectrum. So it makes a lot of sense to be looking at skilling going forward. Could you just share a thought, Prachi? I mean, sorry to ask you this, put you on the spot, but specifically to COVID, and the challenge of education and skilling, the relevance of blended finance.
Huge, Karthik, because what the advantage, and I see Abha smiling over there because she'll probably talk a little bit more about what they are thinking of in structuring some of these instruments in the wake of COVID. But the relevance has increased even more because you want to now, in the face of the pandemic, in the face of a crisis, really maximize the efficacy of every single philanthropic dollar which is going out there. So there has been interest from the government in these, can we roll them out sooner? There has been interest from more and more philanthropic organizations to collaborate. And, the objectives can always be different. The objective for one stakeholder can be to crowd funding, but the objective for other can be we get deeper impact, and we actually ensure that we get the deep impact that we want. So there are different motivations, but the relevance at this time is very high.
Great, thank you very much, Prachi. And we'll come to Abha soon, and and I'm really keen to learn more about the skilling piece for sure. But before that, we'd love to hear from Dhun. Hi, Dhun. Specifically the perspective of risk capital. You guys have been involved in, I think, so many different impact bonds. So we are also risk capital as Asha Impact, and we're now evaluating whether we should invest in some of these bonds. So we'd love to hear your perspective on how you have gone about this, and a couple of specific questions then which you could focus on, which is, what is the current investor sentiment amongst investors globally, HNIs, institutions, after all of this erosion in wealth that has happened, right? What appetite is there for deploying additional risk capital? And are investors looking at this from their philanthropic buckets or their commercial buckets? How are global investors looking at blended finance in India? And the final issue that comes up is this force majeure risk, right? Which COVID itself is one. That how do you price in these kind of risks and so on? So would love to hear from you, Dhan, on all that UBS Optimus is doing, and overall the perspective of risk capital in this industry of build.
And thanks, Prachi, for those insights and for sharing those examples. I will get to your questions, Karthik, and I think those are more of the technical ones, but maybe what I will do is start off with maybe broader thoughts on what is needed in the education and skilling sector, and particularly in light of COVID now, how blended finance, social finance can play a role, and then how do we also look at growing the market more broadly, more widely. But maybe
speak a little bit louder, Dhan. Sorry, it's the audio is a bit low.
Is that better now?
Yes, slightly better.
So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about the UBS Optimus Foundation, which is basically a client-facing foundation within UBS that is the world's largest private wealth manager. Now, the funds that we apply through the Optimus Foundation are from UBS, its employees, and UBS's clients, so mainly ultra and high net worth individuals that bank with UBS. So this puts us as a foundation in an interesting and unique position, and really frames one of our key objectives, which is to bring more and better funding for development programs, and particularly to provide catalytic funding to drive innovation and impact. So we target the last mile and bottom of the pyramid users and are very much focused on maximizing impact first, even as investors. So now just a little bit about our social finance work. We look at three key areas in social finance. The first being building the ecosystem for outcomes-based financing and blended finance through knowledge exchange, creating platforms, and providing grant funding where needed. Second area is testing new instruments and delivery models. And that's really where in the past and currently we provide risk investment to a number of outcomes contracts, including for impact bonds in India and South Africa as well, and a number of others in pre-launch phase. A social success note, Karthik, you talked earlier about social success note in Uganda, and also we look at making direct investments into social enterprises. And then the third area that we look at, so once these instruments are tested or we've proven delivery models, looking at leveraging synergies to take these models to scale, such as looking at work where we are pooling risk investment through a UBS social impact fund, or designing a primary health outcomes fund targeted in Africa, or looking at an education financing facility in Africa as well. So all of these are at scale and then in partnership. So with that context, in terms of who we are as an organization, I'll start off with maybe some reflections on, kind of what's happening in education. What are we seeing through the education impact bond in India and other education programs also in India and globally.
Hi, then. I'm sort of sorry to interrupt. This is Sriram here. I think a lot of people feel that the volume is a little low. Maybe if that's the best you can, then that's all right. But if you could perhaps come closer.
I'll speak louder.
Thank you.
All right, I will try and speak louder. So just coming to then the impact on education and skilling, and in light of COVID, what we're seeing is, I guess, or what is the need that we see is certainly in the mid to long term, talking about education sector resilience, and then how blended finance can play a role there. And but more immediate short-term need being program delivery modifications, looking at what needs to be done during social distancing and lockdown, for example, and then what changes in delivery will be required post-lockdown, really to help children catch up once schools start. And in that, what we're seeing is a lot of innovation around remote and distance learning solutions, and we think that this will play an important role, particularly in maintaining learning continuity for children. But with the caveat or with the understanding that learning outcomes, particularly for lowest income families, will not be the same as in regular classroom delivery, or as we're seeing in high income countries or with high income schools. but remote solutions will help with the continuity and also with some emotional and psychological resilience that will help children when they do come back to school. So it's important nonetheless. But what I feel is key here is also to look at frugal innovation in that sense. So what are the remote solutions that will effectively reach the children with limited and poor access? And so that will be key. Now, given the magnitude of the pandemic's impact on systems, on funding, on organizations, and then of course at a child level, the challenges we're facing in the sector are even more severe than before. And that's where pay for performance can provide a pathway for recovery for the sector. So some of the things that we see or the characteristics within these pay for performance mechanisms through examples like the education dip in India or others is that flexibility and program delivery that's really enabling them enabling the implementers to make the program modifications and continue to work towards achieving goals with flexible funding. And what has also been very encouraging has been the positive response and collective responsibility by funders. And many of these structures actually force funders to come together. And I think by virtue of that funder relationship, there has been a binded commitment to program goals and also commitment to work together to find solutions. So really encouraging things coming out of the sector. But more broadly, how do we use blended finance to kind of catalyze philanthropy in a sort of COVID and post-COVID scenario? What we're seeing right now is a lot of funding being repurposed for emergency relief efforts, pressure on governments, philanthropy to fund locally and take a sort of first things first approach, and also a funding tsunami that we usually see in emergency situations, which all basically means that strong grassroots organizations that are delivering learning outcomes could eventually run out of funding sources. And so the question is, how do we meet short-term funding requirements and yet avoid a hit to development initiatives that might later come? And so while currently there are some short-term challenges, I think there is a huge opportunity for, and now more than ever, for a paradigm shift in how philanthropy and then public spending can drive development outcomes. So while funding pots are being used towards emergency response currently, in time, funding will start to dry up and funders will become more discerning in how and where they apply their resources. And that is where we will need to see more effective philanthropy. And that is where outcomes-based funding can come in, because it has the ability to catalyze the systems focus and to drive the results focus in philanthropic and public spending, and due to two key features. The first being, because of the nature of pay for results, it shifts payment timings. And so funders who are strained now can pay later for results. And secondly, it can bring in different kinds of funders with different risk return profiles and different funding appetites at a time like this. So this timing gap could be interesting and can be funded by investors who also might be interested in market opportunities or that are uncorrelated to financial markets. So now the key will really be, I think, scale. And it will become important to think about how do we look at these solutions at scale in order to build and grow the market. So Karthik, coming to also your question around, how do we do that? How do we grow the market, and what are sort of things to focus on? One of the initiatives that we supported at a global level is the Impact Bond Working Group. And I thought I'd share a few insights from convenings on this very topic. So the Impact Bond Working Group is co-led by us along with Swiss SECO and UK's DFID. And it convenes key bilateral and multilateral donors to basically look at what are the paths to scale for outcomes funding and how do we grow this market. And so the key areas, or three key areas that have emerged from that piece of work have been: to grow the market, we need to look at knowledge exchange, setting up a knowledge hub. And what the Impact Bond Working Group has supported is work by Oxford through the Government Outcomes Lab, looking at outcomes acceleration. So really, how do you support new impact bonds and better quality impact bonds through grant, design grants, technical assistance grants. And thirdly, looking at pooling of funding. So both at the outcomes level as well as, both at the outcome funding level as well as the risk investment levels. So with outcome funding, we've seen big announcements like the World Bank and DFID with over $300 million announced. And on pooling risk investment, we've initiated within UBS and in partnership between the Optimus Foundation and our colleagues within UBS, the setting up of a social impact fund, which will actually make impact first risk investment more appealing for the more mainstream investors. So coming a little bit, Karthik, to your question in terms of who are the investors who actually support programs like this. And through this blended risk investment stack, we really believe that so we're looking at a tiered, basically capital stack with philanthropic funding coming in to cushion the more senior tranches of investment, and doing that in collaboration with the bank's platform. I think overall, looking at really knowledge sharing, making sure that NGOs, intermediaries are capacitated to participate in a market like this, and then looking at pooling funding at scale. I think those are the three key areas that we need to look at going forward.
Great. Wonderful. No, thank you, Dun, for that comprehensive overview and perspective, and so many issues there to pick up on. And we'll come back to that in the Q&A. Hi, Abhag. Great to have you with us. I'd given your intro actually at the beginning of the panel, but just to quickly let everyone know, the British Asia Trust is a not-for-profit, and working with a lot of major donors who are British Indians and British Asians. So I guess a question for you, Abha, is there's many things that the British Asian Trust could have done. So maybe going a little bit back to first principles, why develop an impact bonds? What has been your experience of them? Needless to say, you guys are involved in the different DIBs which have been there in the market, and what do you see as the role for the DIBs in the post-COVID world?
Thank you, Karthik, and very good to see my friends on the panel as well. We were together early morning, I think 6 o'clock UK time. They've gotten used to seeing me in my pajamas regularly. So as collaborative funders, the one thing you get to know is the insides of their houses and their minds very, very early morning, and when not to catch them on the wrong side. So collaborative funding has many advantages. And in a COVID situation, I would say the top advantage is you really do get to know your partners and you work together. So thank you for having me. I will answer the first question. I'll do it in three things. Why did we decide to do this? And we could be doing a lot of other stuff. What did we learn? And what are we doing now? And I'll try and answer on all those three things. I'll try and bring a COVID piece on it. So sort of 3 years ago, we started exploring this space. I'll be honest, we didn't start by saying we want to do blended finance. Let's find the book and let's read it and let's start doing it tomorrow. We started by saying that we have always worked in philanthropy. We've always used grant as a tool. But grant works with the premise that here's a great idea. Let's put some money in it and let's see if it works. Is there a different premise we could start with? Could we start with the premise that we know the outcome that we want to have? And can we actually put funding into it? And can we then see where the funding itself can change the way actors behave? The behavior of all the actors around the table was what I was really excited about. And we went to our friends at the Optimus Foundation who'd done Educate Girls, and we said, right, what do we do together? And they said something big. And I said, what does big look like? And they said nothing under 10 million. And of course, you had to work with the MSDF Foundation at that point. So they were the people who came right after that. And as three partners, we designed and co-designed the education. That's our starting point. What can we do that doesn't fund just a good idea, but funds a result and an impact? And also is so focused on that if it is not achieved, we don't put money in. That's the starting point. Now we've had 3 years in this space, right? We've worked with our partners, we've designed, we've launched, we've fought, we've collaborated, we've implemented, we've had good results, we've questioned our results, we've questioned our targets in some cases. We've questioned our models. We've questioned just about everything as we work together, which is what early adopters do. And the analogy I'll use here for you, Karthik and Aparna, is the one of an iPhone. A person who queues around a block and gets a new iPhone actually is the one who's dealing with the bugs. So we are, as a group of people, the bug users. So we've got the bugs, we've learned from the bugs. And we are, so I'll give you some examples of what that means. So in the beginning, the criticism of impact bonds, and I'm sure it's the same now, and I'm waiting for those questions to come. It costs a lot, transaction costs. So some of the real bug fixtures that we're trying to do as a sector, Dhan referred to, is how do you quicken the pace? How do you get better technical assistance in? So it's faster, quicker, you get the legals done. We're working with the folks like Aparna on how legals can be solved from different kinds of financing coming in. So really making sure that those learnings that we have go into the sector. So that's the first thing that we're really doing. Take the bugs, catch them, make sure that you don't have to wait on your iPhone for a photograph to load. That's one. Second, we believe that the basic premise of an impact bond, right, where you have collaborative funding, you focus on outcomes and not on inputs, flexible, all that's brilliant. But I just don't think it's a textbook that you can follow on that. Depending on the context and depending on the social problem you're trying to solve, you've got to vary it. That's our biggest lesson. Again, I'll use an analogy because it's lunchtime here. It's like getting a recipe from your mother on WhatsApp, right? She'll give you a recipe, there's nothing exact, but it tastes brilliant. You follow a book, it doesn't taste as good. So I suggest that actually the way you approach an impact bond is akin to that recipe on WhatsApp. You say, right, how do I solve my problem? What do I know from my programmatic work or my grant work? And how do I apply it to this? You don't take a technique and then put it into that because it doesn't work. And there could be many things you solve in the recipe. Who is the risk investor? In a post-COVID world, I would say governments could be risk investors because governments got to take risk. Private sector may be bleeding at this time. You could say service providers might take on some of their own risk and change the way the paradigm works. You might say that the outcome could be paid for by somebody very different in this context. So what you do is you take the recipe and you design for what the problem is. You don't start with by saying, this is the recipe I want to apply to this problem. It won't work. So that's my second sort of big input at lunchtime as I'm waiting for my food to come. And the third piece is about COVID and leapfrogging. I think what COVID's done for people like us who are sort of like champions and pioneers of this piece, as a group of us, is to say, how do you leapfrog some of the problems we were having in getting people to adopt them, especially governments? We find that the one thing that's really, really helped us is to leapfrog and say, right, let's jump. We need flexible funding. You need to pivot your model to distance and trade and digital models. Fine, here's some flexible funding. The outcome is all agreed up front. And let's see how you're going to do it. And let's determine how risk transfer is going to work. So that's just 3 bits of learning. On the QE I didn't hear my partners speak about the results in detail, but so I'll speak a little bit about the why behind the results. The good results are great. Again, an analogy here. It's like being a parent, right? You get this amazing report card from your child and you say, oh, this is incredible. Am I an amazing parent or is it because my child's a genius? And the group's sort of there right now. They're going almost, what's going on over here? What's endemic to our providers, or are we the great parents in this piece, or is the div doing it? And I think the answer in all cases, as it is with our children, it is a combination of things. We do have brilliant providers, but brilliant providers provided with the right nurturing environment take their results and absolutely kill it. And that's what we're starting to see. And while we can bottle that up and give you a tonic of the how do you do it for other providers, we hope we can do that for a lot of providers in the coming months. We have an outcome readiness program kicking off. We really genuinely would say that it is about the combination of that nature and nurture piece within the DIB, that focus on performance management where someone's holding your hand, that ability to give somebody the data in the classroom that GMI gives and allows the providers to use that data flexibly and to understand what they change. Finance not being about a log frame about how many trainings you provided, but finance being about what can you do with this money to make your impact happen. Those are the reasons. That's the sort of nurture bit of all of this. And of course, there are these great providers. I would never take away credit from what they've been doing, and that's incredible. So the question you asked me about how do you grow the market, I think for me, there are 3 actors who need to work together on this. There's government. Outcomes, social outcomes, the ultimate buyer of any social outcome in any country is a government. They are increasingly turning to us and asking us to come in and say, right, what can we do together with you? How can we really drive outcomes with society and with other collaborators? So we really believe government capability building is a top priority for PA. The second is the lack of data. The minute you start talking outcomes, and if we didn't have MSDF around, At the education DIB, how do you measure something? They put GMI on the table and said, right, here's a measurement framework you can use. We're looking at skilling now, and we've been in calls just over the last few weeks. The first question is, what data should we be using? What is that measurement piece? And it doesn't exist. We need to invest in it. And the third is, of course, our providers, really getting them ready. And that's a combination, again, of good systematic data usage and attitude. I have to be honest, the best data people may not make the best DIB partners because they may not have the attitude to adapt and learn as they do it. I don't know if I've answered all your questions. I have a bunch of more stuff, but I'd rather have a Q&A and get to what people want to hear than bang on about impact bonds.
No, that's very well put. Thanks for tackling that question of how do we get there. And I wanted to mention tomorrow, Aparna and Sanchi from our team are leading a workshop along with folks like ID Insight, Dahlberg, and all specifically on this issue, which is how do you make an NGO DIBable? And the issue of data, performance management, and capacity. That really has to be the focus. And today we were trying to focus more on the fundraising funders' perspectives and the intermediaries' perspectives. So we have a lot of questions.
Karthik, if I can also add that at 6 p.m. tomorrow, we are also co-hosting another session where we will go into the details and results of a lot of education pilots that I spoke about. So some of the folks who are specifically interested in blended finance for education can also tune into that session tomorrow.
Prachi, I know you have to leave, so if you have maybe 2 minutes, I think there's a question that maybe you could answer before you leave. That's how do you really ensure the long-term sustainability, right? So how does the program really outlive the intervention, or how does the outcomes outlive the intervention? Because in the 3 years or 4 years of the DIB, everyone's kind of focusing with performance management, etc., to make sure that the outcomes are achieved. What happens after that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I would say it's an unanswered question. It's a topic that we deliberate upon with all our partners, and not just in the context of DIB, Aparna. I would say, we debate on that question in the context of all the work that we do, right? That herein comes in the funder with the funding, with a high-powered service provider. You get you get the magic, you get the impact, but how does that impact sustains beyond them? So one, I would say that I wouldn't worry that as my top question, given where we are starting and how low our starting point is. It's not my top worry. If we can get impact, and we can get impact at scale, that in itself is an achievement to celebrate for a few years to come, than to say, okay, how do I actually move on from here and hop on to another setting? So that is one. The second is, I think it will, most of the education interventions that we are working in, we are working with the government. And therein, I would say the critical thing for the outcomes to sustain is that some fundamental shift comes about in the government education systems, right? We should be moving away from the system of service providers or NGOs coming and fixing what is broken within a larger system. And we at Michael and Susan Dell Foundation have a large volume of work, which is just fixing our basic education systems as well. The third, which I think is a much more near-term, short-term objective that most of us as participants in this conversation have, that how can we actually structure more and more of social impact bonds? Because that seems to me the next step where public provisioning of money, which is already happening, can be made more effective and efficient. And that hopefully, will sustain the outcomes beyond a set of funders who really bring in a very small amount of capital when we look at the larger, problem that we are trying to solve. So I think that's the near-term solution that could happen. And I'm also very positive that it will happen based on some of the conversations that we are having.
Good. Thank you for answering that.
Thanks, Aparna. Thanks, Karthik. I'm sorry I have to hop out earlier, but I will connect with you to take up some of the questions offline.
Thank you very much, Prachi. So folks, we've got, I think, over 30 questions. So I'm not sure if we can get through all of them, but we have about 15 minutes. So Aparna, how should we do this? Should we maybe club them by speaker or by topic?
Trying to club them by topic, but perhaps Abha, we can get you started. There's a question about evaluation costs. This is always sort of the elephant in the room. So maybe if you can provide some perspective on that. Obviously people are concerned that evaluation costs are high. How do those get addressed going forward? How do we keep those at a minimum?
Yeah, and let me just add to that. and this is a question, I guess, for both Abba and Dan, right? Which is the reducing the timeline and reducing the cost, right? That there have been X number of DIBs. There's so much interest on this call and in the industry to do more. And of course, there's larger fundamental issues about fundraising, pricing, and so forth. But if we just focus on this issue, which many people are skeptical about, and they say, look, guys, the cost to set up a DIB is so high and the time takes so long, where are we on that? Is that going to dramatically come down, or is it still going to be cumbersome to launch more DIBs?
I can have a first go, and I'm sure Dhan will add some excellent points as well. On timeline, it's as an organization, we're personally committed to reducing timelines on this. And the way we see it, and from our learning, is to do several bits of the work together. There are 3 or 4 streams of work that are required for a DIB to be set up. The fundraising, design, and the legals are the 3 main streams that we do. We do them parallelly as against sequence-wise as we used to do them previously. So one of our big learnings is to do that together, reduce the timeline on some of the setup. So I genuinely believe with scale and time and learning that's there in the market, the timelines are going down. I mean, we see them most obviously. And if anything, COVID's actually enabling our timelines to reduce. We recently, on our transaction that we're on currently, we have a 2-month timeline, and our donors are saying, can you do it faster? And I thought, gosh, there was a time when DIBs were taking 6 months or to a year. So even from the times when we started the education DIB to now, it's a very different timeline. So I don't think timelines need to stretch if the transaction is for meeting the right problem and for the right solution. I think the problem with some DIBs is it's applied to the wrong issues. And I think that therein lies the problem. A DIB doesn't apply for every single problem. That's a one. On evaluation costs, it's a factor of transaction. So if it's a $10 million DIB and the evaluation cost is 5%, 3%, or 2% of it, I think that's perfectly reasonable. It's when you have an evaluation cost on a very small transaction, that's when the economics don't work. The early DIBs were R&D DIBs, and they needed that. But by the time you come to our DIB, we don't think the evaluation costs are high at all, and neither is anybody else. So I think it's a factor of size, and we have a sort of golden rule that we don't do small DIBs, and we actually work at scale, and Dan and others are actually working at even bigger scale than that. So the way the market is going, evaluation doesn't have to cost a lot if you're working with several partners at scale and using a structure that can be applied to several partners. So both those impediments actually, as a market, they're being addressed and actually executed, Karthik, as well.
Dan, you want to add anything to that?
I guess just a couple of quick points. Completely agree with Abba, and it's about a scale question. So as you do move to these pooled funds, you will actually leverage wider architecture on contracting, evaluation, verification for a larger number of separate transactions. So costs will go down per transaction. Also developing local capabilities. So as we invest in building capacities, helping smaller organizations to come up and play the role of in assessment, in verification, and I think moving from assessment, which was really required, a rigorous assessment required to develop evidence base with early transactions, to verification processes which are are low cost, and then using innovation and technology to explore how we can drive down further. So for example, we are piloting the application of blockchain to see how can the overall contracting cost as well as verification cost be driven down in contracts like this.
I know, Aparna, you have more questions, but one more that I saw, which was things relating to COVID, right? Specifically, this force majeure risk, right? And the NGOs who are out there on the ground delivering X work, now because of COVID, there's a lockdown, they can't do it anymore. So I guess 2 questions. For the existing DIBs, where there have those DIBs been impacted and people's operations impacted, and who pays for that risk? That's really the question. And can these be built into contracts? So how do we deal with force majeure risks like COVID?
Karthik, I'll take, and I'm sorry you actually asked me that question earlier, and I missed addressing it. So I think in terms of force majeure, this is definitely something that in most contracts is already looked at. There usually is a force majeure clause And at the time of design of a contract, you are usually pricing for factors excluding force majeure scenarios. So your pricing estimations do not factor this in, but your clauses would typically look like, parties need to engage in discussion and come to an agreement in the case of scenarios like flood or COVID, etc. So I think that is how it is currently structured in most contracts, and I think that is the right approach, because it is very hard to forecast or to price risk into that, and so it becomes then a matter of discussion, negotiation, and determining what amount of risk investors, funders, etc., are willing to bear, and coming to an agreement on that at the time.
I'll add a couple of things, Karthik, on this. We sit within some of the learning groups on this at the Government Outcomes Law. Overall, people aren't applying force majeure clauses globally. Given the severity of COVID, I think the general recourse has been to discussion and collaborative approaches on it, including on our own education, Dave. Nobody has turned to saying either the investors haven't turned the tap off or neither have the outcome funders. We understand this to be a risk as none ever before. And therefore, the idea of force majeure being applied, I can see for a flood or for something which is a minimal, small issue to a certain provider within the contract, but not at the scale that the world is facing currently. So that's the practicality of it. Two is what happens if you don't apply force majeure. Let's look at the reality of it. And there's a spectrum of solutions we are looking at. If the outcomes that you work on still matter, children still need to learn, and and in the case of RDIP, there's no question, children have to continue to learn. If the focus on outcomes has to continue, the group has to agree what degree, what has to change. Do we, for example, reduce the targets that the children have to meet, or do we change the cost ratios around some of that? Alternatively, do we temporarily move to a pay-for-service model and then switch back to a pay-for-outcomes model? There is a whole continuum of decision-making which we've agreed first principles on as a group. And most impact bonds are doing that. The excellent thing about a DIB is you don't have to go back and renegotiate a contract with a service provider as to what they're doing in the classroom. Tomorrow, they can move from training in a certain way and move to a completely different model. All the instrument has to do is at the instrument level, agree those principles, change the few parameters that are required in the case of crisis, and move on. And I think that's actually one of the big strengths of this instrument. If we can make that evidence come out in public domain after this is to pass, so therefore the use there hasn't been a force majeure kind of conversation with most impact bonds is the answer. But there are many interesting solutions that lie between that and the reality that was before.
And let's end with a difficult, perhaps, question, but an important one, which is the challenges that this instrument or this industry faces. Important to discuss, right? We've talked a lot about the potential, and that was the point of this discussion, and the perspectives of the funders. And I think it's been a fairly balanced discussion. But maybe it'll be useful, right? Since a lot of questions have come up, which we've not been able to cover. Specific questions, critical questions, and for example, if you're pricing impact, how do you ensure salaries aren't lowered, and all kinds of issues, which I'm sorry to the folks on the session, we weren't able to cover all of these questions, but we will definitely continue the dialogue. But perhaps we can end by talking about what do both of you feel are the 2 or 3 biggest challenges in this space that all of us collectively as an industry should be working on. What worries you about the next 6 to 9 months? And that can be related to COVID also, but broadly, what could go wrong as we try to mobilize and launch additional DIBs in India specifically?
Dan, do you want to go first?
Oh yeah, happy to go first. I think, Karthik, there are challenges and there are opportunities, but I think mainly, if you ask me what concerns me most, is the challenge of how do you enable wider participation in transactions like this. So really the small, mid-sized organizations to also be able to benefit from this. And that's where a lot of capacity building effort needs to be focused. So really the pipeline challenges of that come in. I think that's the biggest. And then I would say secondly, and this has been a challenge as well as I think a great and positive experience has been the multi-stakeholder partnership. But they do require convening many or bringing together many different stakeholders, reaching alignment and agreement on what are the right outcomes, what are the right benchmarks. And so it can be challenging if not navigated correctly. And we've heard from many who are stuck in design phase that's kind of where, where things don't move sometimes. But it's also, like I said earlier, a great opportunity for actually funders to be coming together on something. So I would say those are the two.
Abha, you don't see funding as a challenge, right?
No, not us.
ESR, the potential of corporates to put more money into this out, because people have said in the past, outcome funding is not always available. Risk capital, presumably you can unlock if people get some return for it. So you don't see that as a challenge, or any other challenges that you wanted to add to that?
So yes, I'll add a couple of challenges. One is, and firstly, I agree with Dhan. I just want to say that I always say that I always agree with my investors, and then we have the fights later, don't we, Dhan? So the first thing I'd say is my biggest challenge is the efficient use of a tool which has a legacy of being slow, being thought of as being slow and complicated in a time where agility is the answer. How do we make the tool agile in the context we're in? I am absolutely determined to be part of that answer and show that agility is possible with the tool in the sector. If we don't use this opportunity to do that, as some of the practitioners, we'll be doing the sector a disservice. Let's kill the transaction time question. Let's kill the cost question during COVID. Let's move quickly. And that's what we're trying to do. And that is a challenge for me. I want to kill that challenge. The second challenge is, why use an impact bond when grant can do grant can do the work better? It's a challenge I ask myself on every single transaction. Can I use grant on this or not? And only when I can answer that challenge for myself do I use an impact bond. Because grant is king in my world, in the philanthropic world. And when grant stops being king is when an impact bond comes in and trumps it. And that's the answer. That challenge doesn't go away for us. Do not use an impact bond when it's not required. And that's when transactions fail as well, because donors don't buy into things that they know can be done through straightforward grants. They're not stupid, right? You go and buy a convoluted thing. The convoluted thing should be there for an exam, for a real reason, that you want an outcome to happen that is not happening otherwise. That's the second challenge. And the final one is one of government. I think really governments need to come on board on this. If they start buying outcomes and we're able to change the regulatory environment in a way they understand how they can procure outcomes, they're used to procuring inputs, we can really have transformative change. And that is really the big cheese in this discussion. As I'm speaking, it's getting dark in London. So suddenly my room's gone all dark. Sorry. I've just noticed.
The thunderstorm here in Delhi. I don't know if you can.
Thunderstorm in Delhi. London's always like this. Lucky me. So that's from my side. I can go on, but the most important things I've told you, and then it's actually.
No. Thank you to both of you, and to Prachi as well, who's no longer on the call. And it's exactly 6 p.m. So as promised, we'll sign off exactly at 6 to stay on time. And I hope you guys will join the rest of the sessions. And I think there's a plenary session with Mr. Kailash Satyarthi at 7. So thank you all very much. This was a panel discussion with leading funders and intermediaries who have really pioneered the impact bond market in India and globally. So thank you to all of you for sharing your insights on the existing models, focused on education and skilling, and what structures are most relevant for a post-COVID world. How do not-profits need to scale these models, and perspectives on how additional risk capital and outcome funding can be mobilized. And thank you, Shriram, who is the host of our panel, and to everyone at Asha Impact team for organizing this. So thank you very much.
Abha. Thank you, Abha. Thank you, Dan, for coming at really short notice and helping us all with this. Thank you.
Pleasure.
You guys. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Hi, Akanksha.